For years, an elderly woman lived in seclusion in her mansion, a prisoner to the grief of a devastating loss. Everything changes when an abandoned boy shows up at her gate, asking only for a glass of water. What begins as a simple act of compassion ends up forever changing the lives of everyone in that house. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's get back to it. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. The rain fell hard on the rooftops of Ashton Hills that June afternoon, forming small rivers on the steep slopes of the Hudson Valley town. The heavy sky seemed to reflect the weight hanging over the Thompson estate, an imposing mansion from the early last century, with its tall windows, neglected gardens, and a silence that had echoed through its empty halls for years. Helen Thompson was 72 years old and hadn't come down the stairs of her own home in almost 6 years. Her bedroom on the second floor had become her entire universe, a small, cramped, suffocating universe. The heavy curtains remained drawn, blocking out the sunlight and any trace of life that tried to penetrate the space. She spent her days sitting in her burgundy velvet armchair, staring into the void, reliving memories that seemed more real than the present. Memories of Anthony, her husband, who had passed away, leaving a void impossible to fill. The entire house seemed to have aged along with her. The garden, once filled with yellow roses and fragrant jasmine, was now just a tangle of overgrown weeds. The furniture collected dust, despite the dedication of Amelia, the housekeeper, who had worked there for over 20 years. Amelia tried to keep everything in order, but it was as if the house itself had given up on breathing. Robert, Helen's only son, visited his mother twice a month, always in a hurry, always with his phone in hand, always with that distant look of someone who was only physically present. At 45, Robert had built a tech empire with companies spread across 3 states. His professional success was inversely proportional to his emotional presence. He didn't know how to talk about feelings, didn't know how to deal with his mother's pain, didn't know how to fill the space his father had left. So he simply avoided it. He paid the bills, made sure his mother had the best of everything, and went on with his hectic life in New York City. On that rainy afternoon, Amelia was in the kitchen preparing Mrs. Thompson's afternoon tea, as she did every day when she heard the gate bell. It was a rare sound. Almost no one came here. The house was in a remote neighborhood on top of a hill, surrounded by high walls and iron gates. Amelia wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the intercom. On the other side, through the small black and white screen, she saw a boy. He must have been about 10 or 11, far too thin, with his face pressed against the bars, soaked by the rain. His clothes were old, too big for his frail body, and his dark eyes stared intently at the camera with a mixture of hope and fear. Amelia pressed the intercom button. Her voice came out a bit rough, as it always did when she was tired. "We don't give handouts here, son. Try the church downtown." The boy didn't move. He just kept looking at the camera, the rain streaming down his face. "I just want a glass of water," he said, his voice both thin and hoarse. "Please." Amelia sighed. She had a good heart, but she also had orders. Mrs. Thompson didn't like strangers on the property, and Robert always reinforced that during his visits. "Security first," he'd say. "You never know who's on the other side." She was about to turn off the intercom when she heard a voice she hadn't heard in months, a weak but firm voice. "Let the boy in, Amelia." Amelia spun around so fast she nearly dropped the tea tray. There, on the interior balcony overlooking the entrance, was Helen. She had come down the stairs. For the first time in almost 6 years, Helen was out of her room. The housekeeper was so surprised she couldn't speak. She just stared at her employer, who was leaning on the banister in her light blue silk robe, her grey hair in a loose bun, her eyes fixed on the intercom screen. "Amelia, open the gate," Helen repeated, this time with more authority. The housekeeper obeyed, still in shock. The gate opened with a metallic groan, and the boy ran in, crossing the neglected garden to the front door. Amelia opened it, and he stood there dripping water on the marble floor, shivering from the cold. Helen descended a few more steps, holding onto the railing. Her knees ached, her legs were weak, but something inside her pushed her to continue. She reached the foyer and stood face to face with the boy. He was even thinner up close. His eyes held an old sadness, a sadness that shouldn't exist in someone so young. There were small scratches on his arms, and his fingernails were dirty. "What's your name?" Helen asked, with a gentleness that surprised even herself. "Lucas, ma'am," the boy replied, lowering his head. "Amelia, prepare a warm bath for Lucas, and find some of Robert's old clothes, the ones he left here when he was a boy. They should be in the guest room closet." Amelia was still processing what was happening, but she nodded and hurried up the stairs. Helen looked at Lucas and made a gentle gesture. "Come, sit here in the living room. I'll have them prepare something warm for you to eat." Lucas followed Helen into the living room, a huge space with antique furniture, a dust-covered crystal chandelier, and a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. He sat on the edge of the sofa, afraid of soiling the cream-colored upholstery. Helen sat in an armchair across from him, and for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. She felt needed. "Where did you come from, Lucas?" she asked, her voice softer than it had been in years. "The shelter, ma'am, St. Vincent's over by the bus station. And why did you leave?" Lucas looked down, his small hands clutching his knees. "It's bad there, ma'am. The older kids beat us up. And the adults, they don't care. They just want us to be quiet." Helen felt a tightness in her chest. She knew what it was like to feel invisible, ignored, left behind. "How long have you been there?" "Since my grandma passed. It's been 3 years. Helen noticed the delicacy with which he used the word "passed," as if to soften the pain. "And do you have any other family?" "No, ma'am, it was just her. My mom left me with her when I was real little. Never came back." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Helen saw in Lucas a pain she knew well. The pain of abandonment. The pain of loneliness. The pain of having no one. Amelia returned with clean clothes and took Lucas to the downstairs bathroom. While he washed, Helen sat in the living room, her mind racing. She didn't quite understand what she was feeling, but she knew something had changed. For the first time in years, she felt something other than sadness. She felt compassion. She felt purpose. When Lucas returned, dressed in blue sweatpants and a white t-shirt, both far too big for him, Amelia had already prepared a bowl of vegetable soup and warm bread. She set it all on the kitchen table, and Lucas ate as if he hadn't eaten in days. Each spoonful was devoured with a hunger that went beyond the physical. It was a hunger for affection, for attention, for someone who cared. Helen watched from the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame. Amelia approached her and whispered, concerned, "Mrs. Thompson, what are you planning to do with the boy? Mr. Robert isn't going to like this." Helen looked at the housekeeper with a determination Amelia hadn't seen in years. "I'm going to take care of him, Amelia. At least for tonight. I can't send him back out into the rain. But Mrs. Thompson, Amelia, I've made up my mind." The housekeeper knew there was no point in arguing. She nodded and returned to her tasks. Lucas finished eating and looked at Helen with gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am, you're very kind." Helen smiled. It was a small, faint smile, but it was a smile. "You'll sleep here tonight, Lucas. Tomorrow we'll talk about what to do." Lucas nodded, his eyes shining with a mix of relief and hope. Amelia prepared the guest room, changing the sheets and opening the windows to air it out. It was a simple but cozy room with a twin bed, an old wardrobe, and a window overlooking the garden. When Lucas lay down, he looked like a little bird in a nest that was too big. Helen stood at the door for a moment, watching. "Sleep. Well, Lucas, tomorrow is a new day." "Good night, Mrs. Thompson, and thank you again." Helen closed the door and slowly climbed the stairs back to her room, but for the first time in years, she didn't close the curtains. She left them open, allowing the moonlight to stream in. She lay down in bed and, before falling asleep, felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt hope. The next morning, Helen woke up early. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating the room in a way she had forgotten. She got up, dressed with more care than she had in years, and went down for breakfast. Amelia was in the kitchen, preparing fresh bread and coffee, and nearly dropped a cup when she saw her employer walk in. "Good morning, Amelia. Is Lucas awake yet?" "Not yet, ma'am. He must be tired. Helen sat at the table and drank her coffee in silence, but her gaze was different. There was a spark there, a flicker of life that had been extinguished for so long. She finished her coffee and went out the back door, something she hadn't done in years. The garden was unrecognizable. What were once organized flower beds were now just a tangle of wild plants and weeds. Helen walked slowly through the garden, her hands touching the leaves, feeling the earth beneath her feet. Memories surfaced, memories of Anthony, kneeling beside her, planting roses. Memories of laughter, of conversations, of sunny afternoons spent there. She felt a tear run down her face, but this time it wasn't just from sadness. It was from longing, yes, but also from a certain peace. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice when Lucas appeared beside her. The boy was barefoot, still wearing the oversized clothes and looking at the garden with an air of reverence. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson." "Good morning, Lucas. Did you sleep well?" "Yes, ma'am. Very well. It's been a long time since I slept in a real bed." Helen looked at him and saw that Lucas was also observing the garden. His eyes scanned every corner, every plant, as if he was seeing something precious. "The garden is so neglected," Helen said, almost as if talking to herself. "But we can fix it," Lucas replied with sudden excitement. "If you want, I can help. I know how to take care of plants. My grandma taught me." Helen looked at the boy, surprised. She saw in him a determination, an enthusiasm that contrasted with the sadness she had seen the day before. "You like gardens, Lucas?" "I love them, Mom. My grandma had a small garden in her backyard. We'd spend afternoons taking care of the flowers, watering them, pulling weeds. She used to say a garden is like life. If you take care of it with love, everything blossoms." Helen felt a lump in her throat. Those words resonated deep within her. She looked at Lucas and for the first time saw not just a lost boy, but a gentle soul, a child who, despite everything he had been through, still had love to give. "Then let's take care of this garden together," Helen said with renewed firmness. Lucas smiled. It was a wide, genuine smile that lit up his face. "Really, Mrs. Thompson, we can?" "Yes, we can. But first you need to have breakfast. Come on, let's go inside." They returned to the house, and Amelia served Lucas breakfast. He ate with the same hunger as the day before, but this time there was something different. There was joy. Helen sat at the table with him, and for the first time in years, she talked, really talked. She asked about Lucas's grandma, about the plants he used to care for, about what he liked to do. Lucas spoke with enthusiasm, his eyes shining with each memory. "My grandma used to say that every flower has a story. She taught me the names of all of them. Rose, jasmine, daisy, violet. She said flowers are like people. Each one has its own beauty, its own way, its own time to bloom." Helen listened intently, absorbing every word. She felt something growing inside her, something that had died with Anthony, something that was coming back to life. The morning passed quickly. Helen and Lucas went out to the garden again, and this time they started to work. Amelia brought old gloves and some gardening tools that had been stored away for years, and they began to clean up. Lucas worked with impressive dedication, pulling weeds, clearing the flower beds, talking the whole time about what they could plant there. Helen, who hadn't moved so much in years, felt her body ache, but it was a good ache. It was the pain of being alive, of doing something. She looked at Lucas and saw a young version of herself, full of hope and determination. The hours passed without them noticing. When Amelia called them for lunch, the garden already looked different. There was still a lot of work to do, but you could already see the flower beds, the stone paths, the structure that had been hidden under the weeds. Helen and Lucas washed their hands and sat at the table. Amelia had prepared a simple but delicious lunch, pot roast, potatoes, and a salad. Lucas ate with gusto, and Helen, for the first time in years, also ate with an appetite. While they were eating, the gate bell rang again. Amelia went to answer and returned with a worried expression. "Mrs. Thompson, it's Mr. Robert. He's on his way up." Helen felt a knot in her stomach. She knew her son wouldn't approve of what she had done. She knew there would be conflict, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to face it. Robert entered through the front door as he always did, fast, talking on his cell phone, gesturing. He ended the call when he saw his mother in the dining room. "Mum, what's going on? Amelia called me saying there's a boy here." Helen stood up, facing her son. "Yes, Robert. His name is Lucas. He came here yesterday asking for help and I took him in." Robert looked at Lucas, who was sitting at the table with his eyes downcast, clearly uncomfortable. "Mom, you can't just bring a stranger into the house. It's dangerous." "He's not a stranger, Robert. He's a child who needs help." "Mom, you're not thinking straight. This kid could have run away from somewhere. There could be people looking for him. You could be getting into legal trouble." Helen remained calm, but her voice was firm. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Robert. And if someone is looking for him, then we'll handle it the right way. But I'm not sending him away without making sure he'll be safe." Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew that tone in his mother's voice. It was the tone she used when she had already made a decision. "Mom, I understand you're feeling lonely, but this isn't the solution." Helen looked at her son with an intensity he hadn't seen in years. "Robert, I'm not doing this because I feel lonely. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. And yes, maybe I am feeling less lonely now. But that doesn't change the fact that this boy needs help, and I can help him." Robert didn't know what to say. He looked at Lucas, who kept his head down, and then at his mother, who was standing tall, firm, with a spark in her eyes he hadn't seen since before his father passed. "All right, Mom. But at least let me look into this. I'll hire someone to find out where this kid came from, and if there are any legal issues involved." Helen agreed. "Fine, Robert. But in the meantime, he stays here, with me." Robert nodded, still reluctant, but knowing he couldn't change his mother's mind. He stayed for a few more minutes, spoke briefly with Lucas, asking his full name and where he was from, and then left, promising to return in a few days with information. When the door closed, Helen sat back down at the table next to Lucas. The boy looked at her with teary eyes. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson, I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Helen took Lucas's small hand in hers. "You didn't cause any trouble at all, Lucas. You brought me something I thought I had lost. You brought me hope." Lucas smiled, and a tear rolled down his cheek. Helen wiped it away with her thumb, with a gentleness that surprised even herself. "Now let's finish our lunch and then get back to the garden. We have a lot of work to do." And so, that afternoon, as Helen and Lucas worked side by side in the garden, something magical began to happen. The house, which had been steeped in silence and sadness for so long, began to awaken, and with it, Helen also began to bloom again. The following days brought a quiet but profound transformation to the Thompson estate. The garden, once a tangled mess of neglect, began to take shape again. Helen and Lucas spent their mornings working side by side, pulling weeds, pruning wild bushes, and rediscovering the stone paths that Anthony had laid decades ago. Lucas was a tireless worker. His thin arms carried buckets of soil, his small hands pulled out stubborn roots, and his eyes shone with every small victory. He spoke of the plants as if they were old friends, using the names his grandmother had taught him. "Look, Mrs. Thompson, there's a mint plant here. My grandma used to say mint is strong. It always grows back, no matter what." Helen listened to every word, rediscovering a world she had left behind. She remembered when Anthony used to say the exact same thing about the plants. "They're stronger than we think, Helen. They just need a little care and patience." Amelia watched it all with a mixture of joy and concern. She was happy to see Mrs. Thompson out of her room, moving, smiling. But she also knew the situation with Lucas was temporary and complicated. Robert had made it clear he would investigate, and no one knew what that might reveal. On Thursday of that week, Robert returned. This time he wasn't alone. He brought a lawyer with him, Mr. Morris Taylor, a tall middle-aged man with thin-rimmed glasses and a leather briefcase under his arm. The two entered the living room, and Robert called his mother and Lucas for a talk. Helen came down the stairs calmly, holding the banister with Lucas by her side. They sat on the sofa, while Robert and Mr. Taylor took the armchairs opposite them. "Mom," Robert said, his tone more serious than usual, "I did the investigation I promised. Mr. Taylor here can explain the legal situation." The lawyer adjusted his glasses and opened his briefcase, taking out some documents. "Mrs. Thompson, Lucas, I've looked into the public records and contacted St. Vincent's shelter. The situation is delicate, but not impossible to resolve." Lucas shrank into the sofa, his eyes fixed on the floor. Helen placed a hand on the boy's shoulder in a protective gesture. "Mr. Taylor," continued, "Lucas ran away from the shelter 5 days ago. The institution filed a missing person report, but they haven't started an active search yet. I spoke with the director, a Marissa Foster, and she stated that the shelter is overcrowded and that frankly they don't have the proper resources for all the minors in their care." "And what does that mean?" Helen asked, her voice firm. "It means that if you're interested in keeping the boy in your custody, we can start legal proceedings. First, temporary guardianship while we investigate the conditions at the shelter and evaluate the best option for Lucas." Robert leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Mum, this is serious. You'll have legal responsibilities. You'll have to ensure he gets an education, health care, everything. And we don't know how long this will take." Helen looked at her son, and then at Lucas, who still kept his eyes down. She saw the scratches on the boy's arms, saw the way he trembled slightly, and felt an absolute certainty. "I want to do this, Robert. I want custody of Lucas." Lucas lifted his head abruptly, his eyes wide. "Really, Mrs. Thompson?" "Really, Lucas?" Mr. Taylor nodded, taking notes. "Very. Well, I'll file the paperwork this week. But we'll need a psychological evaluation for Lucas, a home inspection, and possibly a hearing with the family court judge. It could take a few weeks." Robert still looked worried, but there was also something different in his eyes. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was relief to see his mother with a purpose again. "All right, Mom. If this is what you want, I'll support you. But please, let me help. I'll make sure everything is done correctly." Helen smiled at her son, a genuine smile. "Thank you, Robert." After Robert and Mr. Taylor left, Helen and Lucas returned to the garden. The boy was more animated than ever, talking non-stop about the plants, about what they could plant, about how beautiful the garden would be. But Helen sensed that deep down there was a fear that all of this was temporary, a fear that he would have to go back to the shelter. That night, after dinner, Helen went up to Lucas's room. He was sitting on the bed, flipping through an old book about plants that Amelia had found in the library. "May I come in?" Helen asked, knocking. Helen, lightly on the door. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson." Helen sat on the edge of the bed beside him. "Lucas, I want you to know something. No matter what happens, you have a place here. With me." Lucas looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "But what if the judge says I have to go back to the shelter?" "Then I will fight for you, Lucas. I will do everything in my power to make sure you stay here, where you are safe, where you are loved." Lucas couldn't hold back his tears. They streamed down his face, and he threw himself into Helen's arms, sobbing, "I'm so scared, Mrs. Thompson. I'm scared of losing all of this, of losing you." Helen hugged the boy tightly, feeling her own heart ache. "I'm scared too, Lucas. Scared of losing you. But we'll face this together, okay?" Lucas nodded, still holding on to her. Helen stayed there until he calmed down, until his breathing became steadier. She helped him lie down, tucked him in, and kissed his forehead. "Sleep, my boy. Tomorrow is a new day." When Helen returned to her room, she felt an overwhelming emotion. She hadn't cried since the E-cow day Anthony passed, but that night, alone in her room, she let the tears come. Tears of fear, of hope, of love. Tears that cleansed, that healed. The following weeks were intense. Mr. Taylor worked quickly, organizing all the necessary documentation. A psychologist visited the house to evaluate Lucas and talk with Helen. The woman, a kind lady named Dr. Beatrice, spent hours talking with the boy, listening to his stories, observing his interaction with Helen. At the end of the evaluation, Dr. Beatrice spoke with Helen privately. "Mrs. Thompson, I rarely see such a strong bond form so quickly. Lucas trusts you in a way that is almost moving. He speaks of you with affection and respect, and most importantly, he feels safe here." "And how is he emotionally?" Helen asked, anxious. He carries trauma, like any child who has been through what he has. There are signs of emotional neglect, and he mentioned incidents of violence at the shelter, but there's also an impressive resilience in him. With the right environment, with love and stability, I'm sure he will recover. Helen felt an immense sense of relief. Thank you, doctor, thank you so much. The social worker responsible for the home inspection also came, a young woman named Frances. She walked through every room, asked questions about their routine, about the plans for Lucas's education, about the support Helen would have. Amelia answered many of the questions, assuring her that the house was well cared for and that she would always be there to help. In the end, Frances smiled. Mrs. Thompson, you have a beautiful home and an even bigger heart. I will recommend temporary guardianship without any reservations. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. Helen dressed carefully, choosing an elegant navy blue dress, and Lucas wore a new outfit Robert had bought for him. They went to the courthouse together, accompanied by Mr. Taylor and Robert. The courtroom was small and formal. The judge, Judge Frank Anderson, was a stern-looking man but had kind eyes. He listened attentively as Mr. Taylor presented the case, explaining Lucas's situation, the conditions at the shelter, and Helen's desire to assume guardianship. The judge then turned to Lucas. Lucas, can you tell me what happened at the shelter? Lucas swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Helen, who gave him an encouraging nod. It was bad, Your Honor. The older kids would hit us. One time a boy pushed me and I hit my head on the wall. Look, I still have the mark. Lucas lifted his hair, revealing a small scar near his temple. The judge made a note, his face growing more serious. And the adults in charge, what did they do? They didn't care, sir. We'd complain, but they'd tell us to stop making up stories. They said we had to learn to defend ourselves. The judge looked at Helen. And you, Mrs. Thompson, why did you decide to take this boy in? Helen took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. Your Honor, I lost my husband a few years ago. Since then, I've been lost. I couldn't find a reason to go on. But when Lucas showed up at my gate, something changed. He brought me back to life. And I want to give that back to him. I want to give him the love, security, and home that he deserves. The judge was silent for a moment, observing Helen and Lucas. He saw the way the boy moved closer to her, the way she placed a protective hand on his shoulder. He saw something genuine there, something rare. Very well, the judge said finally. I grant temporary guardianship of Lucas Hayes to Mrs. Helen Thompson for a period of 6 months. During this time, the home will be monitored by social services, and at the end, we will evaluate the possibility of permanent guardianship or adoption. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor, Helen and Lucas replied in unison. When they left the courthouse, Lucas was beaming. He held Helen's hand tightly, smiling from ear to ear. We did it, Mrs. Thompson, we did it. Helen felt immense joy, but also a responsibility. She knew the next 6 months would be crucial. She had to prove she could take care of Lucas, that she could be what he needed. Robert, who had watched everything in silence, approached his mother. Mom, I'm proud of you. I know it hasn't been easy, but you're doing the right thing. Helen looked at her son, surprised by the emotion in his voice. Thank you, Robert. That means a lot to me. Robert knelt to be at Lucas's level. And you, kid, you take good care of my mom, okay? She's very special. Lucas nodded seriously. I will, Mr. Robert, I promise. Back at the mansion, life settled into a new routine. Helen hired a private tutor for Lucas, a patient woman named Marcia, who came 3 times a week for lessons. Lucas proved to be an exceptional student, absorbing knowledge with an impressive thirst. He loved math, solving complex problems with ease, but he also enjoyed reading, especially stories about nature and adventure. The afternoons were dedicated to the garden. Helen and Lucas had become a perfect team. He learned quickly, understanding the cycles of the plants, knowing when to water, when to prune, when to just let nature take its course. The garden, once just weeds, now had organized flower beds, flowers beginning to bud, and a sense of life that spread throughout the property. One afternoon, as they worked together, Lucas asked, Mrs. Thompson, why was the garden so neglected? Helen stopped digging, leaning on her spade. She looked around at the roses that were beginning to bloom and sighed. After my husband passed, I couldn't bring myself to come out here anymore. This garden was his favorite place. We spent hours here tending to the plants, talking, dreaming. When he was gone, I felt like the garden died with him. Lucas nodded, understanding. My grandma used to say things don't really die. They just go to sleep, waiting for someone to wake them up again. Helen looked at the boy, her eyes misty. Your grandmother was a wise woman, Lucas. She was. I miss her a lot. I miss Anthony too, every day. But now, taking care of this garden with you, I feel like he's here somehow, like he's happy to see life coming back. Lucas smiled. I think he is happy, and I think my grandma is too. She always said that good people find each other even if it takes a little while. Helen hugged Lucas, and the two stood there, in the middle of the garden, surrounded by blossoming flowers, feeling a deep connection that went beyond words. The months passed quickly. Lucas adapted completely to life at the mansion. He had his own room, his own clothes, his own books. Amelia adored him, always making his favorite dishes and listening to his stories. And Helen, who had once lived in isolation in her own room, now spent her days with the boy, teaching, learning, growing together. Robert also started visiting more. He noticed how different his mother was. She smiled more, talked more, lived more, and slowly he began to be part of this transformation. He spent weekends at the mansion, playing with Lucas in the garden, talking with his mother about things they had never discussed before, about feelings, about loss, about the father he also missed every day. One evening after dinner, Robert and Helen were alone on the porch. The sky was full of stars, and the scent of the garden flowers filled the air. "Mom," Robert began, his voice hesitant, "I want to apologize." "Apologize? For what, Robert?" "For not being there. For leaving you alone all these years. I was so focused on business, so wrapped up in work, that I forgot what really matters." Helen took her son's hand. "Robert, you were dealing with your grief in your own way. I understand that. I closed myself off too. But now with Lucas here, I've realized that life goes on, and that there's still time for us." Robert nodded, fighting back tears. "I want to be here more, Mum. I want to get to know Lucas better. I want to be a real part of this family." Helen smiled, squeezing her son's hand. "You've always been a part of this family, Robert, and you always will be." The two sat there in silence, looking at the stars, feeling a peace they hadn't felt in years. But not everything was perfect. The social worker, Francis, made regular visits, assessing how Lucas was adapting, how Helen was handling her responsibilities. And although the visits were always positive, there was an underlying tension. The temporary guardianship was coming to an end, and soon the judge would have to decide on permanent custody. One morning, shortly before the EE deadline, Francis arrived with troubling news. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to inform you of something. St. Vincent's Shelter is contesting the guardianship. They've sent a representative to speak with the judge, arguing that Lucas should be returned to the institution." Helen felt the world spin. "What? Why?" "They themselves said they didn't have adequate resources. I know, Mrs. Thompson, but it seems there are political pressures involved. The shelter receives government funding based on the number of children in its care. Losing a child means losing resources." Helen was furious. "That's absurd. Lucas isn't a number. He's a child." "I completely agree, Mrs. Thompson, and I will do everything in my power to make sure the judge sees that. But you need to be prepared. There may be another hearing, and this time it will be tougher." Helen felt fear grip her chest, but she also felt a fierce determination. She was not going to lose Lucas, not after everything they had built together. That night, she didn't tell Lucas anything. She didn't want to worry him. But after he went up to bed, she stayed awake, planning, thinking through every possibility. She knew the fight was just beginning, and she was ready to fight. The news of the new hearing arrived on a grey Monday. Mr. Taylor called Helen early in the morning, explaining that the judge had scheduled a special session to hear the arguments from St. Vincent's Shelter. The date was set for 2 weeks from then. Helen felt a tightness in her chest but remained calm. She knew she had to be strong, for Lucas, for herself. For those 2 weeks, life at the mansion continued, as if nothing was wrong. Lucas woke up early, had breakfast with Helen, had his lessons with Marcia, and spent his afternoons in the garden. But Helen noticed he was different, quieter, more observant, as if he sensed something was happening. One afternoon, as they were watering the roses together, Lucas finally asked, "Mrs. Thompson, are you worried about something?" Helen hesitated but decided to be honest. "I am, Lucas. There's going to be another hearing. The shelter is trying to get you to go back there." Lucas dropped the watering can, the water spilling onto the dirt. "But I don't want to go back, Mrs. Thompson. I want to stay here with you." Helen knelt in front of the boy, holding his shoulders. "I know, my dear, and I'm going to do everything, absolutely everything, to make sure you stay. But I need you to be strong. I need you to trust me." Lucas hugged Helen tightly, his tears soaking her shoulder. "I trust you, Mrs. Thompson. I trust you more than anyone in the world." Helen hugged the boy back, feeling the heavy responsibility on her shoulders. She couldn't fail. She couldn't let them take Lucas from her. Robert, upon hearing about the new hearing, was furious. He scheduled a meeting with Mr. Taylor to discuss their strategy. The three of them gathered in the mansion's library, papers spread across the old oak table. "Morris, what exactly is the shelter claiming?" Robert asked, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, consulting his documents. "They're claiming the guardianship was granted too hastily, that there wasn't enough time to properly evaluate the situation, and that Helen, due to her age and history of isolation, is not fit to care for a child." "That's ridiculous," Robert exploded. "My mother is doing better now than she has in years. Lucas was the best thing that could have happened to her." "I agree," Mr. Taylor said calmly, "but we need concrete proof. We need to show the judge that Lucas is being well cared for, that he's developing, that he's happy. And we also need to expose the inadequate conditions at the shelter." Helen, who had been listening in silence, spoke for the first time. "Morris, you mentioned that Lucas talked about the abuse at the shelter. Can we use that?" "We can, but it's delicate. We'll have to have Lucas talk about his trauma again, and that could be difficult for him." Helen nodded, determined. "Then, let's prepare. Let's gather everything we need. Reports from his tutor, the psychologist's evaluation, photos of the garden, anything that shows his progress." In the following weeks, the house became a hub of preparation. Marcia, the tutor, prepared a detailed report on Lucas's academic performance, highlighting his intelligence and dedication. Dr. Beatrice, the psychologist, also sent an updated evaluation, showing how much Lucas had improved emotionally since being with Helen. Robert, for his part, used his contacts to investigate St. Vincent's shelter. He hired a private investigator who uncovered a series of irregularities: overcrowding, a lack of qualified staff, and previous complaints of neglect that had been dismissed. All of this would be presented to the judge, but the most difficult moment was when Mr. Taylor spoke with Lucas about the need for him to testify at the hearing. They sat in the living room, and the lawyer explained carefully, "Lucas, you're going to have to tell the judge what happened at the shelter. I know it's hard, but it's important." Lucas looked at Helen, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I know you can do this, Lucas, and I'll be right there with you the whole time." Lucas took a deep breath. "Okay, I'll do it. But only if Mrs. Thompson promises she won't leave me." Helen felt her eyes well up with tears. "I promise, Lucas. No matter what happens, I will not leave you." Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. Helen dressed elegantly in a navy blue suit that conveyed seriousness and dignity. Lucas wore the best suit Robert had bought for him, a grey ensemble with a blue tie. He looked older, more mature, but his eyes still held the fear of a child. The courtroom was more crowded this time. Besides the judge, Mr. Taylor, Helen and Lucas, the director of St. Vincent's shelter, Marissa Foster, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, was present with her lawyer, as was Francis, the social worker. Judge Frank Anderson opened the session, explaining that he would hear all sides before making a decision. Director Foster spoke first. She argued that the shelter had the capacity and structure to care for Lucas, that he was just one child among many who needed help, and that the guardianship granted to Helen had been premature. "Your Honor," Foster said in a firm voice, "we are not questioning Mrs. Thompson's good intentions. But A child needs more than good intentions. He needs a structured family, an environment with other children, proper preparation. Our shelter offers all of that. The shelter's lawyer added to her statement, presenting documents that showed the facilities, educational programs, and even testimonials from other children who were supposedly well adjusted. When it was Mr. Taylor's turn, he began methodically, presenting the reports from Marcia, Dr. Beatrice, and the photos of the garden. He showed Lucas's academic progress, his emotional improvement, and the bond he had developed with Helen. Your Honor, what we are seeing here is not just a temporary guardianship. It is a transformation. Lucas has found in Mrs. Thompson not just a shelter but a home, a place where he is seen, heard, and loved. And this is not just the family's opinion, it is the assessment of qualified professionals. Next, he presented the private investigator's report on St. Vincent's shelter, the irregularities, the overcrowding, the previous complaints. Director Foster became visibly uncomfortable, trying to contest every point, but the evidence was clear. Finally, the judge turned to Lucas. "Lucas, would you please approach the bench?" Lucas stood up, his legs trembling slightly. Helen also stood, but the judge stopped her. "Mrs. Thompson, please remain seated. I need to speak with Lucas alone." Helen hesitated but nodded, sitting back down. Lucas walked to the front, standing before the judge. The man leaned forward, his gaze gentle. "Lucas, I need you to be honest with me. What was your life like at the shelter?" Lucas swallowed hard, his hands shaking. "It was bad, Your Honor, really bad." "Can you tell me what happened there?" Lucas looked at Helen, who gave him an encouraging wave. He took a deep breath and began. "The older kids would hit us. They'd take our food, rip our notebooks, make us do their chores. And when we complained to the adults, they didn't care. One time, I got punched in the stomach and was in pain all day. I went to the nurse's office, but the lady there said I was lying, that I was being a baby." The judge paused, observing the boy. "And when you ran away, why did you go to Mrs. Thompson's house?" "I didn't know where to go, Your Honor. I just wanted a safe place. And when I got to her gate, I saw the garden. Even though it was all overgrown, I could see it had been a beautiful garden. And I thought that maybe whoever took care of a garden like that must be a good person." "And you were right, Lucas." Lucas nodded, tears beginning to stream down his face. "I was, Your Honor. Mrs. Thompson is the kindest person I've ever met. She takes care of me, she teaches me things, she makes me feel important. She makes me feel like I have a real family." The judge looked at Helen, then at Director Foster, and finally back at Lucas. "And you want to stay with Mrs. Thompson?" "More than anything, Your Honor. Please don't send me back to the shelter, please." Lucas was crying openly now, his words coming out between sobs. The judge motioned for him to return to his seat. Lucas ran to Helen, who hugged him tightly, whispering words of comfort in his ear. The judge was silent for a long moment, reviewing the documents, looking at everyone present. Finally, he spoke. "This is a difficult decision. On one hand, we have an institution that, despite its difficulties, has the legal role of caring for vulnerable minors. On the other, we have a woman who has shown love, dedication, and the ability to care for a child." He paused, his eyes resting on Lucas. "But what weighs most heavily in my decision is the child's well-being, and it is clear to me that Lucas is better off with Mrs. Thompson than he ever was at the shelter." Helen felt her heart race. Robert beside her squeezed her hand tightly. "Therefore," the judge continued, "I grant permanent custody of Lucas Hayes to Mrs. Helen Thompson. St. Vincent's shelter is prohibited from making any further attempts to remove the child unless there's concrete evidence of neglect or abuse, which is not the case here." The room was silent for a moment, and then Lucas burst into tears of joy. Helen was also crying, hugging the boy with all her might. Robert wiped his own eyes, trying to maintain his composure. Mr. Taylor was smiling, satisfied. Director Foster stood up abruptly, clearly displeased, but there was nothing she could do. She left the room with her lawyer, leaving behind an atmosphere of relief and happiness. When they left the courthouse, the sun was shining brightly. Lucas held Helen's hand with one hand, and Robert's with the other. He was jumping with joy, laughing and talking non-stop. "We did it, we really did it." Back at the mansion, Amelia was waiting with a chocolate cake, Lucas's favorite. She had decorated the house with flowers from the garden, creating a festive atmosphere. Lucas ran to hug her, telling her all about the hearing, about how brave he was, about how he could now stay forever. That night after dinner, the family gathered on the porch. Helen, Robert, Lucas, and even Amelia, who was invited to sit with them. The stars shone in the sky, and the scent of flowers filled the air. Robert looked at his mother and Lucas and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like he was part of a real family. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want to thank you for showing me what really matters, for bringing me back." Helen smiled, holding her son's hand. "You were always here, Robert. You just needed to find your way back." Lucas, who was sitting between them, looked at them both with affection. "I'm so lucky," he said. "I have the best family in the world." The following months were pure happiness. Lucas continued his studies with Marcia, showing a special talent for math. He solved complex problems with ease, and Marcia suggested he participate in school competitions. Lucas loved the idea. The garden also continued to flourish. Helen and Lucas had become expert gardeners, cultivating not only flowers, but also herbs and vegetables. The garden was now a place of peace, beauty, and life. Robert began to spend more time at the mansion. He reduced his workload, delegated more responsibilities to his managers, and prioritized being with his family. He and Lucas developed a strong relationship. Robert taught the boy about business, about decision-making, about resilience, and Lucas taught Robert about simplicity, about appreciating the small moments, about the value of love. One afternoon, while the three of them were in the garden, Lucas asked a question that took everyone by surprise. "Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Robert, can I call you Grandma and Uncle?" Helen's eyes filled with tears. "Of course you can, my dear. Of course you can." Robert was also emotional. "I'd love that, Lucas. I'd love to be your uncle." Lucas smiled, that wide, genuine smile that lit up his whole face. "So now I have a grandma and an uncle. I have a real family." But the story was far from over. One evening, as Helen and Lucas were having dinner, the boy made an observation that would change the course of everything. "Grandma, you know there are a lot of kids like me, kids who are alone who need help." Helen nodded thoughtfully. "I know, Lucas. It's very sad. What if we could help them too? What if we opened up the house to other kids, at least for a little while until they find families?" Helen was surprised by the maturity of the suggestion. "But Lucas, that would be a huge responsibility. And would you be willing to share the house, the attention?" Lucas looked at her seriously. "Grandma, I know what it's like to be alone, scared, with no one. If I can help someone not go through that, I want to help." Helen felt an immense pride in the boy. She looked around the large mansion, with its empty rooms, its silent hallways, and she realized Lucas was right. They had the space, the resources, the love to give. That night she talked to Robert about the idea. Her son, surprisingly, was completely supportive. "Mom, I think that's a wonderful idea, and I can help financially. We can turn part of the house into a temporary foster home." And so, a new chapter began in the life of the Thompson family. They contacted social services, child welfare NGOs, and began the process of becoming a foster family. The house was adapted, new rooms were prepared, and everything was done with great care and love. The first case arrived a few months later. 3 siblings, 2 girls and a boy, who were about to be separated because no shelter had room for all 3 of them together. Julia was 12, Marina was 9, and Peter was 7. They had lost their parents in an accident and had been in the system ever since. When they arrived at the mansion, they were scared, suspicious. Julia, the oldest, had taken on a protective role over her younger siblings. She didn't trust adults, didn't trust promises. But Helen and Lucas were prepared. Lucas was especially kind to Peter, showing him the garden, teaching him about the plants, sharing his toys. Amelia prepared the children's favorite dishes, and Robert brought gifts, books and games. But it was Helen who won over Julia. She saw in the girl the same pain she had seen in Lucas, the same distrust, the same fear. So, one evening, she sat with Julia on the porch, just the two of them. "Julia," Helen said softly, "I know you're scared, I know you don't trust me, but I want you to know something. You and your siblings will not be separated, not while you're under my roof." Julia looked at Helen, her hard eyes beginning to soften. "How can you promise that?" "Because I know what it's like to lose someone you love, and I know that the love between siblings is one of the strongest bonds there is. I will not break that bond. Ever." Julia didn't answer, but Helen saw a tear roll down her face. It was a start. In the following months, the three siblings began to adjust. Peter became inseparable from Lucas, following him everywhere. Marina, who was shyer, found a mother figure in Amelia, helping her in the kitchen and learning to bake cakes. And Julia, slowly, began to trust, began to smile, began to be a child again. The house, once silent and empty, was now filled with laughter, conversation, and life. And Helen, who had once been lost in her grief, was now more alive than ever. She had found her purpose. She had found her reason to go on. 2 years had passed since Julia, Marina, and Peter arrived at the Thompson estate. What began as a temporary foster placement had turned into something much larger, much deeper. The children were no longer just guests. They were part of the family. The adjustment hadn't been easy, especially for Julia. She had built walls around her heart, walls that took months to come down. But Helen, with her infinite patience, and Lucas, with his unique understanding, managed to show her that it was safe to trust again, that it was safe to love. One day Julia sought out Helen in her room. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the house was bustling with preparations for a family dinner. Julia knocked lightly on the door, and Helen invited her in. "Grandma Helen," Julia began, using for the first time the term Lucas had adopted 2 years earlier. "Can I talk to you?" "Of course, my dear. Sit here with me." Julia sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. "I wanted to thank you for everything, for not giving up on us, for keeping us together." Helen felt her eyes well up with tears. "Julia, you have nothing to thank me for. You've given me as much as I've given you." Julia shook her head. "No, Grandma, you don't understand. When our parents passed, I thought I'd never be happy again. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life taking care of my siblings alone, afraid someone would separate us, but here in this house I learned that you don't have to be alone. That family isn't just about blood, it's about choice. It's about love." Helen hugged the girl, and they cried together. They were tears of healing, of gratitude, of deep love. When they pulled apart, Julia had a shy smile on her face. "Grandma, there's something else I wanted to ask. Have you and Uncle Robert ever thought about, adopting us for real, making us Thompsons too?" Helen was speechless for a moment. The question had caught her by surprise, but at the same time it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Oh, Julia, of course we've thought about it, every single day, but we wanted to be sure it was what you all wanted too." "It is, Grandma. Me, Marina, and Peter have already talked about it. We want to be a real part of this family. Forever." That night, during dinner, Helen made the announcement. Seated at the table were her, Robert, Lucas, Julia, Marina, Peter, and Amelia, who now always dined with the family. Helen stood up, her glass in hand. "I'd like to make a toast," she began, her voice emotional, "to this family which has grown in ways I never imagined possible, and to announce that Robert and I are going to begin the process of adopting Julia, Marina, and Peter." The table erupted in joy. Marina started to cry. Peter jumped from his chair, shouting with happiness, and Julia ran to hug Helen. Lucas was beaming, hugging his younger siblings. Robert, who had become a father figure to them all, was also visibly moved. Amelia, who had witnessed the entire transformation from the beginning, wiped her tears with her apron. "Mr. Anthony would be so proud," she whispered. "So proud." The months that followed were filled with preparations and paperwork. Mr. Taylor handled the adoption process with the same dedication he had shown in Lucas's case, and this time there were no challenges. Social services had seen firsthand how the children had flourished under Helen and Robert's care. The final adoption hearing was scheduled for a spring morning, everyone dressed up for the occasion. Julia, Marina, and Peter were nervous, but also excited. When Judge Frank Anderson, the same judge who had granted Lucas's custody years before, declared the adoption official, the emotion in the room was palpable. "Congratulations to the Thompson family," the judge said with a genuine smile. "You are an example that true love knows no bounds." When they left the courthouse, now as an officially complete family, Robert suggested they stop at a flower shop. He wanted to buy flowers to take to the cemetery for his father. "It's important that he knows," Robert said, "that the family he started is still growing, still strong." Everyone agreed, and together they went to the cemetery where Anthony was laid to rest. Helen hadn't been there in years, but now with her children around her, she felt strong enough. They placed the flowers on the grave, and Helen spoke softly, as if Anthony could hear her. "Anthony, my love, you always said that the garden we plant today blooms tomorrow. You were right. Our garden has bloomed, and now we have 5 grandchildren to continue caring for it." Lucas, who was standing beside Helen, placed a hand on her shoulder. "He knows, Grandma. I'm sure he knows." Life at the mansion took on a new dynamic. With 5 children, the house was always full of movement, laughter, small conflicts, and grand reconciliations. The garden, which had been saved by Helen and Lucas, was now cared for by everyone. Each child had their own flower bed, their favorite plants, their responsibilities. Lucas, now 15, had become a thoughtful and determined young man. He continued to excel in his studies, especially in math, but he had also developed a deep interest in psychology. He read books on child development, on trauma and resilience, on the importance of family bonds. One evening, after dinner, Lucas sought out Helen in her room. She was sitting in her armchair reading a book by the lamplight. He knocked lightly on the door. "Grandma, can I come in?" "Of course, my dear. What is it?" Lucas sat on the edge of the bed with that serious expression he wore when he was thinking deeply about something. "Grandma, I've been thinking a lot about the future, about what I want to do with my life. And what do you want to do, Lucas?" "I want to help children, children like I once was, children who are lost, scared, alone. I want to study psychology, specialize in working with vulnerable children." Helen smiled, proud. "I think you would be wonderful at that, Lucas. You have empathy, sensitivity, and life experience. But that's not all, Grandma. I want to create something bigger, a center, a place where families can learn about adoption and foster care, where children can find new homes, something that makes a real difference." Helen looked at her grandson with admiration. She saw in him the same determination she had seen years ago when he arrived soaked at her gate, asking for just a glass of water. But now, that determination was mature, focused, powerful. "Lucas, I will support you in everything. Whatever you need, we're here. Me, Robert, all of us." Lucas hugged his grandmother tightly. "Thank you, Grandma, for everything, for saving me, for giving me a family, for teaching me that it's worth believing in people." The years passed. Lucas graduated from high school with exceptional grades and received a full scholarship to study psychology at a prestigious university in New York City. He came home to Ashton Hills every weekend, always eager to see his family, to work in the garden, to hear the stories of the new children Helen and Robert continued to foster temporarily. During his studies, Lucas developed his thesis on the importance of family-based care versus institutional care. He used his own story as a case study, with Helen and Robert's permission. The thesis was acclaimed, winning awards and academic recognition. But Lucas didn't stop there. At 23, a recent graduate, he returned to Ashton Hills with a detailed plan. He gathered the family in the living room, the same room where Helen had first welcomed him so many years ago. "I want to create the Hope and Bell Center for Adoption and Family Care," Lucas announced, showing them a complete proposal. "A place where families interested in adopting can get guidance, where children can be psychologically prepared, where we can make a real difference in many people's lives. Robert, who at 55 had become a more humane and present businessman, was impressed by his nephew's maturity and professionalism. "Lucas, this is incredible. How much do you need to get started?" Lucas showed him the numbers and Robert nodded. "I'll invest. I'll be your partner in this project. But on one condition: the center has to carry our family's name, what we represent." Lucas smiled. "Actually, Uncle, I already had a name in mind. Remember Belle, the little dog you had when I first came here? Grandma told me she's buried in the garden, under the yellow rose bush." Robert nodded, moved by the memory. "Belle was my dad's companion. When she passed, my dad was so sad. It was shortly before he passed too. So I want to call the center Hope and Belle, because Belle represented unconditional love and loyalty, and because the garden where she rests is where it all began for me, where I found hope." Helen, who had been listening in silence, began to cry. "Lucas, your grandfather would be so happy, so proud." The Hope and Belle Center opened a year later in an emotional ceremony. The building was in downtown Ashton Hills, a spacious and welcoming place with counseling rooms, an auditorium for workshops, a library, and even a small indoor garden, designed by Lucas and cared for by the whole family. The opening ceremony was attended by local officials, social workers, psychologists, and dozens of families interested in adoption. Helen was in the front row, next to Robert, Julia, Marina, Peter, and Amelia, who was now officially considered part of the family. Lucas took the stage to give a speech. He wore an elegant suit, but his eyes still held the kindness that had characterized him since childhood. "When I was 10 years old," he began, his voice firm but emotional, "I ran away from a place where I felt invisible, where I was just another number. I arrived wet, hungry, and scared at the gate of a woman who didn't know me. She could have sent me away, but she didn't. She saw me. She heard me. She welcomed me." He paused, looking at Helen, who was wiping away tears. "That woman taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice. It's about being present. It's about a love that is built every day, with patience, with dedication, with small gestures that make all the difference." Lucas continued, his voice gaining strength. "This center exists because I was lucky, because I found a family that saved me. But how many children aren't that lucky? How many remain invisible, waiting for someone to see them? This center is for them, to connect children who need a home with families who have love to give." The audience applauded emotionally. Throughout the ceremony, several families who had adopted through the center shared their stories, stories of transformation, of love, of new beginnings. The Hope and Belle Center quickly became a benchmark. Lucas developed innovative programs, workshops for adoptive parents, support groups for children in the adoption process, and even a mentorship program where volunteers committed to being present in the lives of children who had not yet found permanent families. The Thompson estate also became a model. Helen and Robert continued to foster children temporarily, always with the support of Lucas and the center. Every child who passed through there took with them not only the experience of a loving home, but also the hope that it was possible to start over. Julia, now 19, decided to follow in Lucas's footsteps. She enrolled in college for social work and began an internship at the Hope and Belle Center. Marina, at 16, discovered a talent for art and used her skills to create educational materials for the center. And Peter, at 14, became the official assistant gardener at the mansion, keeping alive the tradition Lucas had started. On a Saturday afternoon, 5 years after the center's inauguration, Lucas received a call that would change everything again. It was from a journalist at a major New York newspaper. She had heard about the work of the Hope and Belle Center and wanted to do a major feature story. The article was published on the cover of the special feature section with photos of the family, the center, the garden. The story of Lucas, of Helen, of how a glass of water transformed into a revolution of love, touched thousands of people. The center received donations from all over the country, volunteers offered to help, and most importantly, dozens of families got in touch, wanting to adopt. With recognition came more responsibility. Lucas was invited to give lectures at universities, to participate in conferences on child welfare, to advise on public policy. But he never forgot his roots. Every weekend he returned to Ashton Hills, to the mansion, to the garden, to his family. Helen, now 83, had become an admired figure in the community. She actively participated in the center's activities, gave testimonials, and welcomed families interested in fostering. Her story inspired people of all ages. One morning, while watering the roses in the garden, Helen felt a presence beside her. It was Lucas, who had arrived early that Saturday. "Grandma, can I ask you a question?" "Of course, my dear. Do you regret anything? Letting me in on that rainy day, changing your whole life?" Helen put down the watering can and took Lucas's hands in hers. "Lucas, that day was the day I started living again. Before that, I was just existing, waiting for time to pass. You gave me purpose, you gave me joy. You gave me a family that is beyond anything I could have imagined. I don't regret a single thing. I'm only grateful." Lucas hugged his grandmother, and the two stood there, in the middle of the garden they had saved together, surrounded by flowers that represented their journey. Yellow roses, jasmine, daisies, violets, each with its own story, each with its own beauty. That same year, Lucas's work was recognized nationally. He received a Social Merit Award at a grand ceremony in Washington, D.C. On stage, as he accepted the honor, he called Helen, Robert, Julia, Marina, Peter, and even Amelia to join him. "This award isn't just mine," Lucas said, his voice echoing through the packed auditorium. "It belongs to everyone who believes it's possible to change the world one child at a time. It belongs to my grandmother Helen, who taught me the meaning of unconditional love. To my uncle Robert, who showed me it's never too late to change. To my siblings Julia, Marina, and Peter, who taught me that family is a choice. And to our dear Amelia, who was always there, with care and dedication." The audience rose in a standing ovation. But the most emotional moment came later, when a reporter asked Helen what the secret was to transforming lives. Helen, with her soft but firm voice, replied, "There is no secret. There is only love. Love that chooses to be present, that chooses to see the other person, that chooses not to give up. When you open your heart to a child, you're not just changing their life, you're changing your own too." Lucas decided to write a book telling the whole story. He worked on it for 2 years, interviewing every family member, revisiting memories, recording every important detail. The book, titled From the Gate to Hope, became a national bestseller. The proceeds were used to expand the Hope and Bell Center, opening branches in other cities. But perhaps the most significant moment of all came years later, when Lucas, now 32, decided to get married. He had met Carla, a psychologist who worked with him at the center, and the two had fallen in love. The wedding was held in the mansion's garden, surrounded by the flowers that Lucas and Helen had planted together so many years ago. During the ceremony, Lucas gave an emotional speech. He spoke of how true love always finds a way, how a lonely old woman and a scared little boy found each other and created something extraordinary. How that connection expanded, touching hundreds of lives. At the end, he turned to Helen, who was sitting in the front row at 87, still radiant. "Grandma, none of this would exist without you. You saved me, you loved me, you taught me to be who I am. This garden, this family, this love we're celebrating today, it all started with your courage to open that gate. Thank you for everything." Helen was crying, but they were tears of happiness. She looked around and saw everything they had built, a large, loving family, a center that changed lives, a garden that flourished, and she knew that Anthony, wherever he was proud. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. The Hope and Bell Center continued to grow, helping thousands of children find homes. The mansion remained a refuge of love and care, and the garden continued to bloom, generation after generation. Helen, in her final years, would often sit on the porch watching the children play in the garden. Julia now had her own children, who ran among the flowers. Marina had become a recognized artist, using her art to promote the cause of adoption. Peter worked as a landscaper, taking the lesson of the garden to other families. And Lucas, her Lucas, had become a national voice in the defense of children's rights. One quiet autumn afternoon, as the sun set, painting the sky orange and pink, Helen was in the garden with Lucas. They had just planted new roses, and the smell of fresh earth filled the air. "Lucas," Helen said, her voice weaker now but still full of life, "I want you to know something important. When you appeared at that gate, I was dead inside. But you brought me back, and not just me. You brought back this whole house, all this love. You taught me that it's never too late to start over, never too late to love." Lucas held his grandmother's hand, feeling the fragility of the bones beneath the wrinkled skin. "Grandma, you're the one who taught me that. You showed me that love is stronger than any pain." Helen smiled, that soft, comforting smile. "Then we learned together. And that's the most beautiful part of it all, that we saved each other." They stood there in silence, looking at the garden. The roses swayed gently in the wind, birds sang in the trees, and the house in the background was lit up and full of life. Years later, when it was Helen's time to pass, she was surrounded by all those she loved. Lucas held one of her hands, Robert the other. Julia, Marina, Peter, Amelia, Carla, and even her great-grandchildren were there, creating a circle of love around her bed. Helen looked at each of them, her eyes still shining. "I had a good life," she whispered, "full of love, full of purpose. Take care of each other. Take care of the garden. And always remember, family is what we choose to build every day." And then, peacefully surrounded by love, Helen closed her eyes for the last time. The garden was the place chosen for Helen's final rest, next to Anthony and Belle. Lucas planted an entire garden of yellow roses around her, her favorite. And there, in that place that represented everything they had built together, the family continued to gather, to celebrate, to remember. The Hope and Belle Center continued its work, now under its full name, the Hope and Belle Helen Thompson Center. Lucas continued his mission, now with even more determination. He knew that every child helped was a tribute to his grandmother, to the woman who had changed everything with a simple act of kindness. And so the story that began with a wet boy asking for a glass of water transformed into a legacy that touched thousands of lives. A legacy that proved that love, when cultivated with dedication and given without reservation, can flourish in unimaginable ways. A legacy that showed that family is not defined by blood, but by bonds of choice, of presence, of true love. The garden of the Thompson estate continues to bloom to this day, cared for by generations who learned that just like plants, people also need fertile ground to grow. And that ground is made of love, patience, and hope.